All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to dig into something pretty fundamental. We're tracing the origins of a civilization by looking at its foundational texts, exploring how a uniquely documented life, a specific geography, and a preserved word all came together to shape a global faith.
Okay, let's just dive right in with this really powerful claim from our sources. It's from Professor Diaz Margolith at Oxford. And get this, by his own admission, he was no fan of the faith. But even he was just struck by the sheer volume of historical material about the Prophet Muhammad. He says it's so abundant, it's actually hard to get your head around it all, putting it at the opposite extreme from pretty much any other religious founder.
And this huge, detailed record, well, that's really the keystone of the whole story. According to the sources we're looking at, this is what grounds any examination of the faith's founder not just in belief, but in what they describe as an unparalleled mountain of historical documents.
And this contrast is a point the sources keep coming back to. For figures like Zoroaster, Buddha, or even Moses, the historical records can be pretty patchy, right? You've got huge gaps, whole periods of their lives that are just unknown. But for Muhammad, the documentation is described as comprehensive. And we're not just talking about the big moments, but his daily habits, his conversations, his character, all in minute detail. Okay, so now let's zoom out a bit from the central figure and try to understand the world that shaped him. The geographical historians we're drawing on paint a picture of Arabia not as some empty, isolated desert, but as this cradle of ancient peoples and languages. In fact, some of the prominent historians our sources cite make this huge claim that Arabia was actually the original home of all Semitic peoples. The idea they propose is that from this one peninsula, different tribes spread out all over Western Asia, and they eventually developed into the cultures we know as Arabians, Canaanites, and Aramaeans. So this land was just steeped in history. It was home to these ancient and really powerful tribes, like the Ad down in the south and the Thamud up north. Their stories, their kingdoms, their ruins, all of that was woven into the very fabric of the Arabian landscape, long before Islam ever appeared.
And right here you can see the direct line the sources draw between that ancient history and the Quranic text itself. The stories of these peoples, like the Ad and their prophet Hud, they aren't presented as just myths. They're framed as part of this continuous historical and spiritual story that's literally rooted in that specific land.
Now, you can imagine a civilization that's rooted so deeply in this ancient land, well, it didn't just stay there. Let's take a look at how it expanded, how it took to the seas and created this incredibly dynamic maritime world connecting Africa and Europe. And what's really interesting is that this naval power basically evolved out of pure necessity. As you can see here, the early ambitions were aimed at the Byzantine Empire, but a huge catalyst, a real game changer, came from a totally surprising direction: Viking raids in the 9th century. That's what really spurred the rulers of Andalus to build a serious, organized navy. And this all led to this incredible network of powerhouse ports all across the Western Med and the Atlantic. Each one had its job, right? Seville was the place for building warships. Almere was this bustling hub for both trade and piracy, which back then were often two sides of the same coin, and Ceuta. Wow. It became one of the busiest transit zones in the medieval world, the critical link between continents. So this massive expansion, both on land and sea, it brings up a really important question. What was the glue holding this whole civilization together? How did a merchant in Almeria, a soldier in Seville, and a scholar in Medina all share the same basic framework? The answer, according to the sources we're looking at, lies in the incredibly deliberate and meticulous preservation of two central textual traditions. These basically served as the ultimate playbook, the reference point for everything from belief to action. So, first and foremost, you have the Quran. It's described not just as a holy book, but as the most authentic and fundamental source for the prophet's biography. And the sources really emphasize that its textual integrity has remained pretty much undisputed, even by the most dedicated historical critics of the faith. And then, right alongside the Quran, you have the Hadith. This is this massive collection of literature that records the prophet's sayings, his actions, his daily life. And these were preserved by his companions who saw it as their absolute duty to capture his example for all the generations to come.
Now, you might think, okay,
So these were just stories passed down orally for centuries, right? Well, our sources actually push back on that idea, and they push back hard. They point to evidence of written collections being put together by the Prophet's companions in his own lifetime, like this collection called Al-Sadiq, which means the truthful.
And just to give you a sense of the scale we're talking about here, this wasn't some secret knowledge whispered between a few people. Major collections like Sahih al-Bukhari were taught publicly to huge crowds. I mean, get this. The sources record that 60,000 people learned the text directly from just one of Imam Bukhari's students. Just one. That's an incredible level of public distribution and scrutiny.
But all this work, this meticulous historical record, it wasn't just for academic interest. The whole point, as the sources describe it, was to create a practical, living blueprint, an ideal that could guide human life through all its messiness and complexity.
And here's the thing. You know how some great figures might be an example of just one thing, like being a great thinker, or an ascetic, or a statesman? Well, the sources argue that Muhammad's biography presents a comprehensive model. His life gives detailed examples of how to be a leader, a judge, a general, a merchant, a family man, and a friend, all at the same time.
And you can see this model in action at this incredibly high-stakes moment. After years and years of persecution by his own tribe, he finally conquers his hometown of Mecca. His bitterest enemies, the very people who had tried to kill him, are standing there defeated. And he asks them, "So, what do you think I'm going to do with you today?" And after they answer, he just says, "Go your way, for you are free." Just like that. A total blanket amnesty.
And this model wasn't just for big political gestures. It went all the way down to the smallest details of human empathy. I mean, look at this anecdote. He sees a father about to call his kid over from a group of children, and he gently stops him, asking him to use the boy's name instead of saying, "my son." Why? Because as he explained with tears in his eyes, there were orphans playing nearby, and hearing that phrase, "oh my son," might just reopen that wound for them. It's a concern for the smallest, most private heartaches.
So all of this leaves us with a final thought, a final question. How does a historical record of this incredible scope, this incredible detail, and this character, how does that go on to shape a living, breathing faith for billions of people today? The sources suggest that to understand the civilization, you have to first understand its foundation, a faith built on what it sees as the most documented, comprehensive, and practical model for a human life in history. And how that record continues to be interpreted and lived, well, that's the ongoing story.